Hey guys, it's Allie. Welcome back to Infertile AF, the podcast. This is episode 26 called Agnes. So Agnes was introduced to me by a mutual friend of ours, our buddy Roger, and she's an advertising executive in New York City who spent her 20s and early 30s avoiding pregnancy, assuming there'd be plenty of time for marriage and babies, like so many of us do. At 36, she decided to freeze her eggs, and she chronicled the whole thing on this great blog called Frozen Please, which then turned into a book called Eggs Unscrambled. And the subhead of that book is Egg Freezing, Fertility, and the Truth About Your Reproductive Years. And I'm not kidding. This book is so informative and entertaining, and it should be required reading for everybody, especially women. Men too, I feel like could get a lot out of it. But there's just so much that we don't know about our own bodies, and she goes into all of it. So I knew we would have a great conversation, and we did. And I just want to thank her, and I want to thank Roger for introducing us. So without further ado, this is Agnes's infertility story. Hi, Agnes.
Hello.
It's so good to meet you. Thank you so much for doing this. I love your book. I just want to say, first of all, that you have this book that came out, was it 2017? Mm-hmm. It's called Eggs Unscrambled. It's just such a great book about egg freezing, fertility, the truth about your reproductive years. Thank you for deciding to share your story. And I definitely want to talk about the book a lot more, but let's start with how it all started for you. So it was 2012, I believe, that you kind of started to start trying to have a baby, and what happened?
Yeah, so I got married in 2010, and around 2012, probably before 2012, we started to kind of actively try. And I think, as the case with most of these fertility journeys, you start trying just by stopping protection. You stop worrying about when you're ovulating, if you even know what that means, which I didn't at the time, and I'll get into that later. So I think we kind of started trying early on in the marriage, and then trying in earnest about 2 years later, which is where we started to get conscious about the fact that it wasn't happening for us. And that's when I started to have conversations with my GYN. My GYN at that point, I remember my very first conversation with her about it, and I had been seeing her for years. But I said to her, we've been trying to get pregnant, and nothing's really happening. She said, okay, well, at your age, infertility is defined after a year of trying. When you get older, it's 6 months, but at your age, after a year of not trying, you would go and see a fertility doctor. She said, what I would recommend is timed intercourse.
That's sexy.
So hot,
it's
especially
so hot.
like for newlyweds. Like there's nothing hotter than that.
Exactly.
And it gets especially tricky when people are traveling for work, and then you suddenly have to like put things in the calendar.
Right. So you had this really high pressure, high stress, high travel job at the time, and sounds like you still kind of do. You're traveling a lot.
Yeah, that has not changed.
Yeah.
Some things never changed.
So that's adding probably
that adds pressure. That definitely adds pressure. But I think the biggest sort of wake-up moment for me during that time was having the conversation with Dr. Dunham, who's my GYN, and she said, why don't you pick up a fertility kit, an ovulation kit at a Duane Reade, and just start figuring out when you're ovulating. And I was like, wait, what? She's like, yeah, just start timing sex around ovulation. And honestly, at that time, like I knew that you ovulated, but I never considered that you actually have to be so specific about the timing of it, that like they make kits for you to pee on now to figure out when you're ovulating. And I didn't realize that you really could only get pregnant a few days out of the month at a very specific time.
Yes.
And so I was like, oh my God, like there's been so many times that we thought we were trying, and just getting off the birth control pill or getting off whatever form of protection isn't necessarily trying or trying hard enough if you don't know exactly when you're ovulating. So, but that for me really highlighted how little I knew about my body and how the reproductive system works. And I think we are so conditioned in high school, rightly so, to not get pregnant. You know, I remember high school sex education. It was like, if you make out with someone too hard, you might get pregnant.
Yes.
That I think I just had it in my head that like, you have sex, you get pregnant, period.
Yes.
And I never questioned, and no one ever went beyond explaining that.
Yeah.
And so suddenly I find myself having to think about like, wow, okay, so there's only a few days out of the month. Yeah. And, you know, some women spend years on the pill, not even knowing whether or not they ovulate. You don't ovulate every month. Right. And some women don't drop mature eggs every time they ovulate. And these are things that you really don't know until you start to have these conversations with your doctor. And you have to initiate the conversations because most GYNs don't bring it up.
Right.
So that's when I got inspired to kind of start being a bit more vocal about it. And I kind of at that point made the decision that if my ex-husband and I were going to go through the whole fertility thing, that I would be quite vocal about it and that I wouldn't, like a lot of my friends and a lot of women I know, keep it so private. Yeah. Because I just felt like that contributes to the misinformation about it and the assumption that everyone's getting pregnant miraculously on their own in their mid-40s, but also to take away from the shame of infertility. And so when my ex and I went through it, we were pretty open about the fact that we were trying to get pregnant, that we were doing IUI and the drugs and everything else. And then, you know, we went through what I describe in the book as fertility treatment light.
Right. I love that. I love that. So that's what you called the IUI.
That's what I call the IUI with no drug. Well, no, that's actually what I called timed sex with Clomid. And timed sex with certain drugs that we had to take. And then IUI was like kind of the next step of fertility treatment. And we went through a couple of rounds of those. And when those didn't work, Dr. Noyes, my fertility doctor, said, okay, it's time for you guys to move up to IVF.
Okay.
And at that point, we decided we probably don't want to stay married anymore. So IVF is not a good idea.
Yeah.
And then coming out of that relationship in my mid-30s, having just spent the better part of 2 years trying to get pregnant, I started to really think about this notion of fertility and infertility and not having these conversations and then having to face these really basic truths when you're getting out of a marriage at 35 that like, oh shit, I am actively making the decision now to potentially never having children.
Right.
And why haven't I thought about this sooner? And am I going to stay in this marriage just because I don't want to lose out on the potential of having children later? And you just start to question all of these things. Yeah. And that's when I decided to freeze my eggs.
Okay.
And it's when I started to actively blog and write about it and to start to shout from the rooftops that women need to start thinking about this much earlier.
I want to get into all that a little bit like more in depth, like step by step, but I just want to go back to what you said about how the difficulty, like the actual difficulty of getting pregnant. And you wrote this line in your book and you're like, why did no one ever tell me that getting pregnant is not half as easy as we think it is? And that line for me, I was like, yes. It's so true. Like we must have had the same sex education. It was almost like scared straight, you know, like everybody was just so paranoid that then I think that it doesn't like do any favors to men and women, you know, guys and girls growing up because you really don't know what's going on. And it's crazy to me how little people actually know about their bodies. And, you know, we'll talk about this a little bit more too, specifically in your book, but you do this chapter about like the lady bits. And you break down like the menstruation cycle. And I have to be honest with you, I was like, oh, I didn't even know that there were 4 kind of phases. And I was like, I'm 44 years old. And I'm like, you know, talk about fertility and infertility a lot now. And I didn't know that. Yeah. So it's like, wow, there's so much that we don't know. So I thought that was really interesting.
I think that, you know, I go into the high school sex education quite a bit in the book and in the blog. Yeah. Because It's an interesting dilemma in that, the kind of sex education that you and I got was a reaction to a teen pregnancy epidemic. And
Right.
no one wants to go back to that. So
Right.
I understand why we were educated the way we were educated. It was also a response to all of the STDs and like coming out of the AIDS epidemic.
Yeah.
So I understand why we were educated the way
it
we were.
worked.
And it worked
It
because
worked.
teen pregnancy is at an all-time low. But then the other thing that started to happen is women of your generation and my generation also started to gain true independence and started to put off motherhood by choice
Right.
and marriage by
Right.
choice. And so this, the teen pregnancy epidemic was on the decline. Women were starting to gain like real independence, not just like I make some supplemental income independence. And no one addressed the gap between high school sex education and then what really happens
Right.
at a certain age. And no one wants to take on that responsibility. So you kind of, once you've made it through high school without getting pregnant, it's almost like, okay, congratulations. We are now done educating you
Right.
on your reproductive
Right.
organs. And unless, you major in something that's relevant in college, you don't really revisit it until there's a problem to deal with and you're
Exactly.
talking to your doctor.
Yeah. Well, that's why I think your book is so great. And I was telling you before we started recording, I honestly think it should be required reading for women
Thank you.
in their 20s and beyond, because it really does kind of break it down. Like, here's what's happening in your body. This is the no bullshit stuff that you need to know. And I just think it would be so helpful to people who, are wanting to have babies later or are just not really sure what's going on.
Yeah.
Because another thing that you talk about, which I love, was that one reason that women feel like they can put off having kids till later is because culture sends these messages. You see these celebrities who are in their 40s, or like the dads are like in their 60s and 70s, these, celebrity guys
Yeah.
who are seemingly having no problems. Like I remember Halle Berry, you talk about her in your book, and I talked about that in my book Proposal as well, the same exact thing, where it was like, wow, she's like 45 and had a kid, and maybe she did have a medical intervention, but she certainly never talked about it.
Yeah.
So I feel like stuff like that really makes you feel like, oh, I can do that if I need
Yeah.
to.
Well, and it's almost I think as women, we're so conditioned to think we have to breed that if we can't, then it's a sense of failure. And so I think seeing women do it seemingly so easily, you kind of, it's almost a little bit competitive. It's like, I want it to be really easy for me too.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I think so the first thing that contributes to this issue is the lack of education. And then the second thing is culture sends us faulty signals, and women don't want to talk about. And I think that's changing a lot now.
Yeah.
I think there are now a lot of, there are some examples of celebrities actively talking about egg freezing
Yep.
and talking about IVF and the fertility issues that they've had. But back when I started writing the book, it was like, oh, Halle Berry miraculously had a child at 50 or however old
Right.
she was. And same with Janet Jackson. And it's like, why can't we just be honest about the
Right.
fact that it was probably
Yes.
a medically induced pregnancy?
Exactly. So just back to what was going on with you. So you started to do IUI.
So my
Okay.
ex and I did, I think 3 rounds. God, I don't even remember now. Because we had a few rounds of light.
Okay.
Because I was healthy. I mean,
Right.
I have plenty of eggs, and I'll talk a bit more about the egg freezing process. So I didn't know what was going on with me really, but everything looked like
Everything
it was
kinda
normal.
checked out.
Yeah. So
Okay.
like they weren't worried about
Okay.
my follicle count or everything looked totally fine. So I'm not sure why I wasn't getting pregnant. And then I learned through the egg freezing process so much more about my body and what was going on. But my point is we went through a lot of light treatments, and I say that in air quotes because my doctor was like, you're totally healthy. There's no reason that you shouldn't be
Right.
getting pregnant. You just have to keep trying. It will happen. And so with that in mind, I thought, well, I don't want to move up too quickly then to IUI and IVF, because if she's saying I'm fine, then I'm going to keep trying. So we did at least 4 rounds of I was taking Clomid and we were having timed sex. And when that didn't work, we finally moved on to, I think, 2 rounds of IUI. And after that second round is when she said move up to IVF. But even that was taking a toll on our marriage.
Yeah.
And so
Tell me about that if you don't mind.
Yeah.
What was going on?
Well, first of all, I just want to say that, like, my ex-husband is a lovely guy, so I feel like this can so easily turn into, husband bashing.
Oh,
But
no.
he just, I think like a lot of men, I don't know that he had the same sense of urgency around having a child.
Okay.
And he certainly didn't want to, like, upset our lifestyle to do it. And suddenly, when you have two people who are both professionals and both traveling and working a lot, like, the last thing you want to do in your free time, or the last thing you want to put on the calendar, is we have to go have sex, or worse, I have to go and ejaculate into a cup today. Admin, can you please write that into my calendar?
Right.
It does fuck things up a little bit. And it's like, suddenly you go from being like this happy, carefree, on top of the world, we can do whatever we want, whenever we want couple, to like, we have to schedule sex, really. And it just becomes really unsexy very quickly. And I think we learned a lot about each other. And, I learned about how he coped with stuff and life and stress. And he learned how important a child was to me, and like that it would drive me a little bit insane if that couldn't happen.
Yeah. And
that actually it would make me question the whole reason for the marriage existing, which is also another interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, for sure.
And so we weren't on the same page. It caused a lot of stress, and there were other issues. And I'm not saying that the fertility treatments were the cause of the end of the marriage, but it just was like another
contributing factors, for sure. And I think that's pretty common. And I love that you also mentioned that you did. You have to weigh your, am I going to stay in this to have a biological kid with this person? And I think sometimes people do that.
Yeah.
And they end up. So I think it's really brave and like honorable that you were able to recognize, like, okay, even though this is going to put the future and having kids up in the air, might be easier to have kids if I stayed with him.
Yeah.
I think that's great that you took the leap and were like, this isn't my person,
Yeah. Yeah, and it was a hard thing to do, especially at that age. It's not like I was 28. I mean, I also wasn't 45, but it was a weird age to make that decision.
Yeah, totally.
And I think just seeing so much divorce and how it affects kids.
Yeah.
And I came from a pretty ugly divorce family myself. And people do it all kinds of different ways. Like I also have lots of friends who get a divorce and they're all lovely and friendly and all honky-dory, and it's probably even healthier than if the parents had stayed together. But I personally didn't want to be in a situation where I was getting a divorce at 42 with a couple of kids in tow versus at 35 with like myself still intact and like coming out of it unscathed.
Right.
And I knew deep down inside, and I didn't know how yet, but I kind of knew that like I would figure out a way that if I wanted to be a mother, I would become a mother, whether that was me doing it alone or finding someone else. But I think the egg freezing bit also made it feel like there are things I can do to preserve my ability to have children.
Okay, so you took a break and you and your husband split up. How long before you decided to kind of take charge of your fertility and go through with the egg freezing and all of that?
I decided pretty early after we split up.
Yeah.
But I finally did it like a year later.
Okay. So did you know anybody who had done it, or like were you kind of going into it blind?
No, I have a lot of friends who had done it.
Okay.
And who had done variations of fertility treatments. I have a very good friend who had fertility struggles for years. She ended up getting pregnant with donor eggs. And I remember she sat me down.
Was this one of the women in the book?
Yeah, she was in the book.
Yeah.
And she sat me down and said, whatever you do, don't do nothing about this. Like, go and freeze your eggs, and that'll give you some time and space to like figure out what you want to do, but please freeze your eggs. And so I was like, yeah, you know what? You're right. I do need to do that.
Okay.
So I did it about a year later.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how did you prepare for it? You said that you wanted to get in like the best emotional and physical shape of your life. So what kinds of things were you doing? Like just in your day
this
to day?
is silly. Like I did this mostly because of where I was at the time. I think that for me, freezing my eggs was more emotionally charged than it is for a lot of women, because it was a reaction to coming out of a marriage where I was actively trying to have children. So
interesting.
I think that it's, you know, some women do it as just like, oh, this is something I need to do to preserve and prepare. But I was doing it as so
Okay.
I think I just needed to like feel mentally okay that like this is what I was doing rather than having kids, because that was a big struggle for me emotionally through the egg freezing piece. Was like when I finally got through it all, and after all the hormones and all of that, I was like, great, I have 28 frozen eggs to show for them, but no baby. Like, I might as well have just finished the process and done the IVF, because that's kind of where I was mentally.
Okay, I see what you mean.
And so I was a little bit emotionally fragile, and I also felt like being stressed out clearly did not help in getting pregnant. So I wanted to make sure that I was like in the best state of mind to produce as many eggs as possible. I you know, a lot of women, if they don't produce enough eggs the first time, they have to go through 2 rounds. I was like, I can't afford to go through 2 rounds. I need this 1 round to be really successful. And so I just kind of tried to prepare for that mentally. And I mean, I just exercised a lot and ate really healthy, and I stopped drinking. And that was kind of it. But I don't think that you have to do those things.
Yeah, right. So you started your blog as you were going through the process called Frozen Please to document everything, and it ended up becoming this huge thing, and you were doing like all these different components, and you had contributors and all this stuff, which eventually led to this book deal, which is incredible. So tell me about what happened once the blog got going. Like, was it therapeutic for you? And what was the kind of response that you were getting from people too?
It was therapeutic, but I don't think that's why I was doing it, although that was a good little side effect. The response was so incredibly positive. And now I look back and I cringe a little bit, because I was so open, and I don't regret it at all. It's just like seeing yourself on video, giving yourself shots, and like putting it out there for the world to see. It's like, wow, I really did that. I really put it all out there for the world to see.
Yeah, but it's so great.
And I'm glad I did.
Yeah.
It's a funny thing to look back at now.
Right.
But the response was so positive. I mean, everyone just wanted to know more. Everyone was like, I'm so glad you're finally talking about it. Like, suddenly women came out of the woodworks and started to tell me about their own struggles. And the thing that I learned through writing the blog is that once you start talking about it, women are really open and honest. They just need cues from other women. And I did this big talk at JP Morgan Chase about a year ago, and there must have been like 200-300 women in this giant auditorium. And this is a place of business. Like, this is where all these women worked. And I was up there with my client at the time, the chief brand officer, Susan Canavari, who's also now a great friend of mine, and she was interviewing me. And then we took questions from the floor, and we didn't think there would be that many questions, because it's a giant auditorium and it's super personal, and these women all work together. But I think, we went way over in time. People got so personal, asked so many questions, and told their own stories. I felt like it was a giant therapy session for everyone. So I think the point is that the blog, or whether it's a panel discussion or an interview, or the blog, once you talk about it openly, women will open up and will ask questions and will share their own stories. And I think especially if women in certain positions start doing it, like, I think one of the interesting things about the Chase example that I just shared is that the CMO of Chase, who's a woman, got up and shared her own story when she introduced me. And so I think that also inspired women to share, because it's like, oh, she did it, and she's in this position of power and making decisions here, so it's okay for me to share this story. No one's gonna shame or judge me.
I think there was a big thing that happened when Michelle Obama came out about doing IVF with Sasha and Malia, and that was almost like a turning point, where after she said that in her book and like on her book tour, so many people started to come out and be like, oh, I did that too, or I had a miscarriage, or I've been struggling, or I'm not able to get pregnant, so that was really cool. And you're right, like those kinds of people opening
and
the doors.
that's kind of what the blog ended up doing. Like, I got so many messages from people, and I was like, oh wow, people were sharing really personal things.
So tell me how that turned into a book ultimately.
So the blog I never had like a long-term plan for the blog. I have a full-time job that pays the bills. The blog certainly wasn't
your
doing
side
that.
hustle.
It was my little side hustle slash, it was just a passion project. Like I
Yeah.
never expected it to go anywhere, but, and I thought, well, after I'm done with egg freezing, I'll probably stop with the blog and focus on one job at a time. But I had a publisher approach me. A friend of mine mentioned my blog to her, and she looked at it and she thought, oh, this is great. Like, this is so of the moment. And it was, when the whole egg freezing thing was starting to blow up. So she approached me and said, how would you like to write a book? And I naively thought, well, how hard could it be to write a book?
Right. You're like, I'll just turn these blog entries into a book.
Yeah. She's like, now it has to be like content that is totally exclusive to the book. I was like, okay, well, I better start blogging. I stopped blogging like now because I'm going to run out of content. But so that's how the blog turned into a book. Okay. She approached me and asked me if I wanted to write a book.
And how was the book writing process for you?
It was so difficult. It was really hard. So I work in marketing and advertising and my real job, and part of my job is to take complex thoughts and simplify them. Like, that's at the end of the day what advertising is what's the pithiest way you can sell shit to someone. Sort of. I'm oversimplifying it. But it is like, it's about communicating complex messages as simply as you possibly can.
Right.
Writing a book is exactly the opposite.
It's like fleshing everything
It's out. Like flesh it out, go deeper. How about a chapter on this instead? At one point, my editor said to me, why don't you do a chapter on adoption? And I was like, because that would be like writing a cookbook and putting a chapter on seamless in it. Like, it's so, why would I do that? Good. Like, that's not what this book is about. But the point is because you have to get to a certain word count and it has to be a certain thickness. Like, you have to really flesh things out.
It can't be a pamphlet and it's not an ad. Like, yeah, exactly.
And I was like, but how much more do people need to know about this concept or subject? So anyway, it was challenging and I'm so glad I did it.
Yes.
And of course books need to go a lot deeper than blogs.
Yeah.
But personally it was a challenge. Yeah. And I went through a period of, I think it was actually therapeutic in the sense that like this became my baby. It's the thing that I had to like rush home to every night. It's the thing that got me up at 4 a.m. so that I could get a couple of hours of writing in before I went to the office. So it was, especially, coming out of a marriage and having to put off parenthood for a while, it was a really good way for me to like kind of get through that. And at the end of the day, I think it taught me a lot about myself, but it also produced something that I think is really important for women to know about and read.
Yes.
But yeah, I don't know. People always ask me what's the next book, and I'm like, I don't know if I have another book in me unless someone just wants to go ahead and write it for me, because it's actually kind of it's such a solitary exercise. Again, in advertising, you collaborate, you get lots of thoughts and inputs from lots of different people all the time. When you write a book, the editor doesn't even want to talk to you until you've written like 20,000 words or whatever it is. Right. So it's a very different kind of creative mindset.
Well, I think that the book, I said this before, but I'll repeat, it's so good and your voice is so unique and like you make it very interesting and there's funny bits and there's sad parts, it's all the things. But I love in the dedication that you write, Mom, I haven't given you grandchildren yet, but how about a book in the meantime? And I was like, okay, that sets the tone for the book. And it was like funny and heartfelt. And I thought that was such a great dedication. Thank you. But then right off the bat, you get into a lot of stuff that I want to talk about a little bit more too. Women's reproductive rights. And like what's, I think it was 2016 when you started writing it. So he shall go remain nameless. Yeah. The our new president was in office, and you write, America elected a president who's threatened to seriously hinder women's rights by, among other things, disavowing our reproductive freedom, which is so true, and I agree with you. But since then, it's only gotten worse, right? With all the shit that's going on right now. So what's your take on it, all this Roe v. Wade and the abortion clinics, and it's like Handmaid's Tale in real life?
Mean, like, it's truly scary.
Uh-huh.
And it's actually something that is hard for me to reconcile the two ends of the conversation. And I talk about birth control as a spectrum of birth control. Right now is defined really as birth prevention, but birth control really should be about preventing birth when you don't want to get pregnant. But it's also about how do you get pregnant when you do want to get pregnant, because control is also being able to proactively help that process along rather than just preventing it.
Right.
And I bring that up in the context of this because if you think about that spectrum, birth control, as we define it today, the prevention of pregnancy and having babies, is kind of like the Roe versus like all the arguments that we're having right now and the bit by bit taking away women's rights to these clinics. And on the other hand, the sort of well-to-do affluent get to have a conversation about how they proactively get pregnant and fertility treatments. And the two are so disconnected. And I think that just highlights the gap between the poor and the rich, the underserved and the privileged. And it's sad to me because it makes me feel a little bit guilty for even having these conversations. I mean, just a couple of years ago, I was thinking about how health insurance needs to better cover these kinds of services and fertility treatments, and they're getting there and they should, and I still would argue that. But it's so hard to stand up on that soapbox and have that argument now when I know that women are actually losing the right to terminate pregnancies and to birth control, and Planned Parenthood is being defunded. It suddenly becomes hard to stand on the fertility treatment soapbox because it feels like we have to actually go back in time and help this part of the conversation
fix
first.
that first, almost.
And I don't think that's. I think you can have two conversations
but
at the
I
same
see
time.
what you're saying. Well, we should say that you donate some of the proceeds of your book to Planned Parenthood, which is amazing, and that's great.
Yep.
What do you think is going to happen? I mean, and what can we do as women? Like, how do we, aside from like marching and signing all the petitions and donating and all the stuff that we do,
voting differently. I do think that we have to somehow figure out a way to change the narrative and the conversation. I think that unfortunately, like, so much of the things that we deem right and wrong in this country, and so much of our values are steeped in religion and one view, when like these are medical decisions. I don't know why this is like caught up in religion and why it's caught up in politics. These are conversations that should be had between a woman and her doctor. And I think until we can change the course of those conversations and start to like take the moral judgment out of whether a woman has an abortion or not, it's always going to be really polarizing. And until it's really polarizing, women have to get out and vote for the right people, and we have to stop voting for a bunch of old white dicks who are threatening our rights left and right.
Agreed.
And that's it. Like, fuck marches. I'm not going to any more marches. Like, start voting.
Yes. So another thing you talked about in the book that I think is the way that you mapped it out was really great and spot on. And, you go through a lot of life phases where it's like not wanting kids, happily married and trying for kids, being single again, wondering how you'd have a baby, and then wondering if motherhood is even the right choice. So where are you right now? Like, what are you thinking these days, if you don't mind me asking?
No, not at all. So I actually started to try and get pregnant again as a single woman last year. Okay. And I had to go through 6 rounds of IUI before insurance would kick in and pay for IVF. Yeah. So that was a process that I started last year.
Okay. So you used your frozen eggs, or
I generated new eggs. Well, and again, it was just IUI. So it was unmedicated. Okay. Because so again, I'm still IUIs. Like, yes, it's timed IUIs. Okay. So when I went to freeze my eggs, I had like 34 eggs. They froze 28 of them. I react really well to the drugs. Like my ovaries seem to be working. I'm like clockwork still, knock on wood. And so my doctor was like, let's just do timed IUIs to meet the insurance threshold. and you don't have to spend money on drugs or anything. Now, what ended up happening is I got pregnant with my first one and miscarried. And then I started trying again and went through 4 more. And on my 6th one, I was like, okay, I'm about to start this new job. If I don't get pregnant with this last round, I'm going to put this off for about 6 months just because I'm okay to start a new job pregnant, but I'm not okay starting a new job and rushing to the clinic every day to that was going to be too much. So I decided, okay, for my 6th round, I do want to do a medicated round of IUI. And what ended up happening is I was giving myself the follistim shots. So the follistim is what stimulates your ovaries to produce more than one mature egg for preparation of an IUI or an IVF cycle. But my ovaries, again, react really well to the drugs. And in this case, I ended up producing 17, like they were starting to count my follicles. And about a week into the cycle, they were like, you have way too many mature follicles, so we're not going to be able to do an IUI. Let's keep tracking this, but we probably won't be able to do an IUI because you'll end up being pregnant with 4 kids, with 4 babies. I was like, okay, well, I don't want that. But I also didn't want to stop that cycle because now I had spent like thousands of dollars on drugs. And so I decided to turn it into an IVF cycle.
Okay.
Which was crazy. Suddenly they had to up my medication it ended up costing me tons more money than I had planned to spend that month, but it was that or flush everything down the drain. And so I ended up getting 17 eggs. They fertilized 12 of them. Of the 12, 5 turned into 5-day-old blastocysts, and 1 of those turned into healthy embryo. And I state all of those numbers as just like statistically at my age, how many eggs it takes to get to 1 healthy embryo.
Yeah, because how old are you now?
41.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So
that's what happened with me. At 41, I had 1 healthy embryo after all this. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so, but, you know, my doctor said the good news is that you made a healthy embryo and, like, these numbers are totally normal. And to even get 17 eggs on having started you on the low dose of IUI cycle rather than IVF cycle is a really good sign and blah, blah. So anyway, so now I have 28 frozen eggs, a frozen embryo, and still no baby.
Okay.
But I decided to then put the baby thing on hold for a few months. Until I kind of got settled at the new job. Yeah. And now is around the time that I was going to revisit and go back to my doctor and start trying again. Okay. So I haven't done that yet. Yeah. I'm traveling like crazy. It's just that kind of work situation again. Right. I'm fortunate that it's a very, first of all, I'm very open and transparent about this. So this was a conversation that I had with them before I even came into the job. But I'm fortunate that everyone's very supportive, and so I don't feel the pressure of I can't start trying because they're expecting me to not try for a while. But I just would feel better about getting a few things done at work before I go into this. So I'm on a little bit of a pause, but I think probably in the next few months I will go back, and I've already talked to my doctor about what the next step would be at this point. I think she wants me to do fresh rounds still. She's like, until you're producing eggs, let's just keep doing that. Keep going, because you want to save your frozen eggs for as long as you can, because you might decide later that you do want a second child. And maybe at 47, when you decide you want that second child, you won't be able to produce your eggs, so you'll have these frozen eggs. So she's really like protecting those frozen eggs.
Yeah, science is so cool, isn't it? Yeah, it's like incredible. So in doing all the research and stuff with the book, is there anything that you came across that just really surprised you or like threw you for a loop, other than the like how hard it is to actually get pregnant and all that stuff?
Yeah.
Was there anything else that you found that you were just like, whoa?
I mean, I think that the biggest thing remains the realization of how not easy it is. Yeah. I think some of the other things were more like little personal things that I thought about along the way. Like I realized at one point that, being a single mom wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, because you have to think through all these different concepts of like, what do these frozen eggs mean? I think a lot of women freeze their eggs thinking, well, I'll meet someone and then we'll use those frozen eggs. But there are other ways to do it. And I think that that's another thing that women should consider is like, you may not have the traditional family, whether you're a heterosexual woman or not. The truth is, especially in New York City, there are fewer straight men than there are women. And so that is just something to consider.
Yeah.
And why not? Like, if you can do it, who says that you have to have the traditional setup to have a baby?
Totally. So would that be kind of your advice to people who might be listening, who might be thinking, should I freeze my eggs? Should I not?
I think just being open-minded to how you go about things and creating lots of different options for yourself, because it may not work out the way that you thought it would. And that's not a bad thing. It may actually be even better than what you thought you were going to get. And it's not for all women. Like, some women, they don't want kids enough that they would do it themselves. Like, they want the family unit. And I have lots of friends who've said, I've frozen my eggs, but if I don't meet anyone, I'm totally fine to just let those eggs be frozen forever because I'm not really interested in having a child on my own. And that's totally fine, as long as it's how you really feel.
Right. Rather
than a construct that society has said, you have to be married and you have to have a partner in order to be able to have a child.
Right.
And I think that actually there are some friends who, I think if they were a bit more honest, would admit that they haven't met anyone and they regret not just having a child anyway. And so I just think being open-minded about it.
Yeah, just being honest with yourself, like figuring out what you truly, truly want in your heart, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and being okay with, like, this is not, there's no right or wrong way to do it.
Yeah. Perfect. Well, I can't wait to see what happens next for you.
Me
and
too.
Read your next book. And I want everyone to get this book, Eggs Unscrambled. It's so good. It's really entertaining and just really informative too. So thank you for talking to me today.
Of course. Thank you.
Hey again, guys. So thanks for listening to Agnes's story, and thank you to her for sharing it. I would love it if you guys would pass this episode around to anybody you can think of who's in their 20s or 30s who might be thinking about freezing their eggs, doesn't know much about it, isn't sure if they want to have kids, wants to preserve their fertility options for later on. I just feel like everything she taught us today and talked about was so informational and beneficial. So I would love the word to spread around, and definitely make sure you guys check out her book. I will post about it as well, but it's called Eggs Unscrambled. She's on the cover. It's an awesome book cover, which I will post, and I will talk to you guys next time. Thanks.